Alright, today we are covering the 1920s from 1919 to 1929. And there's a couple of different major themes, major topics we're going to cover in this chapter. We are going to look at social turmoil, prosperity, consumption, and growth, challenges due to social conventions, cultural wars, and politics and the fading of prosperity. So let's start off with social turmoil. So probably the biggest and scariest thing that really threatens American society, or they presumed was a threat, was the Red Scare. And this is the Bolshevik Revolution that happened in Russia at this time. And that it was a successful revolution. And what we have is the creation of the Comintern in 1919. And that sparked panic among American leaders known as the Red Scare. And if you go back and you can just Google Bolshevik Revolution, it kind of shows you what this was. It was a working class led revolution. And Russia had been through several revolutions, but this one, notice the date, this was taking place in 1919, kind of like, there was one during the middle of the war, and then there's another revolution not long after that going on in Russia. So there's a lot of turmoil going on, but what ends up happening is they end up replacing like a monarchy. They remove the Tsar of Russia and replace the monarchy with communism. And we'll talk more about communism as we go through this chapter. Then we also have a Supreme Court decision in Schneck versus United States, and that really epitomized the atmosphere of fear that had been growing during the Red Scare. And the decisions used the Espionage Act to uphold the conviction of Charles Schneck, who was found to be in violation of that Espionage Act, for mailing thousands of leaflets opposing the military draft. You have to remember, we were using the draft during World War I. And so he had used the mail to send things out, kind of bashing the government. And when we go into times of war or times of angst, you'll notice your civil liberties being restricted more and more. And so you'll have like the Alien and Sedition Acts, sedition a lot of time, where you cannot say certain things about the government, even if they're true. We saw this during Thomas Jefferson and John Adams during that era. We have this during World War I. We're going to see it used again during World War II. We saw it, maybe not in your lifetime, but in my lifetime with the Patriot Act. You really have to be careful what you say. And a lot of things that you can kind of openly say in 2022, you're not able to say during times of war. So keep that in mind, okay? We do have a lot of liberties here, but sometimes our liberties are very restricted depending on the atmosphere that we're in. And so we have another court case, Abrams versus United States, and the Supreme Court upheld the conviction, citing the clear and present danger doctrine established in the Schneck decision. Basically, what this case says is it sets the precedent where you cannot go into a movie theater and yell fire, because it creates chaos, people get hurt trying to escape, and you've, falsely said something. So, in spite of communism's limited influence in the United States, the presence of a small pocket of radicals generated public fear and concerns about labor unrest. The fear of radicalism was exacerbated, by slow economic growth, inflation, and a weakened agricultural production at the end of World War I. So the economy was kind of bad off, and this fear of radicalism really just plays into, there's already unrest in the United States, and this plays even more into that unrest. Then in 1919, anti-union sentiment and economic hardship stimulated a series of strikes in the steel, transportation, and shipbuilding industries, and in law enforcement as well. Though most of the strikers were ordinary workers with no ties to radicalism, media and the government highlighted communist and social influence, creating the Red Scare. Kind of the same thing that happened. I know some of you weren't born in 2001, or you might have been really little, but the same thing kind of happened after the 9/11 attacks. Not every Muslim is bad. We know that, just like not every Christian is a polygamist. We do have certain, smaller denominations and branches of Christianity where they do extreme things. The same is true of every single religion around the world. The same thing is going on here. Not every person that lives in a communist country is bad. Not everyone that believes in communism is a bad person. But because of the time and the climate of the 19 teens, communism was seen as bad, and everyone that was a proponent of communism was seen as being the evil person or the bad person. We know that's not true of everyone, but kind of think in that mindset. We've seen this play out, right? History does repeat itself, just different circumstances sometimes. And media and government, they can feed into that fear. So radicals, they did exacerbate that sense of fear by mailing devices to well-known Americans. Like they were mailing, we call them like bombs, mail bombs, essentially. Mailing these bombs to Americans and then detonating bombs in 8 different cities. So these are terrorists. These are the extremists. And including one outside the home of U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. And so Palmer, the U.S. Attorney General, right, he's like the lawyer for all of the United States. He responded by really ratcheting up investigatory efforts. And he is going to select J. Edgar Hoover to head the General Intelligence Division in the Department of Justice and authorizing the roundup of hundreds of suspected radicals, most of whom are going to end up being immigrants. Those are the ones that they round up because they're the ones expecting them of being like terrorists. And so in the Palmer raids, investigators detained and interrogated thousands of people without legal counsel. They don't let them talk to a lawyer. They don't even hold them without charge, or they hold them without charges. And so due process was not given to a lot of these people. And because of that, we're going to have the establishment of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, is going to come into play because they're saying you cannot hold someone in prison for months at a time without charging them. That's not right. That goes against their civil rights and their civil liberties. So the creation of the ACLU was created during that time and for that specific reason. And you're going to see the ACLU, they kind of pop up throughout history. They're still around today, but that's where they got started. And, began in 1920, intensifying the anxieties created by, we just got out of World War I, and now we see like communism and the Red Scare. We're having bombs sent through the mail. Then we were having people, detained without legal representation and being detained without being charged. And then on top of that, you've got the Spanish flu, the influenza epidemic. Kind of like today, everything with COVID kind of just exacerbates things, like amplifies them. Right? And the same thing happened between 1918 and 1920. This is what it looked like in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1918, treating people that had Spanish influenza. Notice what they're wearing. They're wearing face masks and all these. And if you go through and you look at anything today comparing the outbreak in 1918, the same debate. Do you have to wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? Is it legal? Is it not legal to require masking? And really, it's the same thing, just trying to keep people safe. That's all that they were trying to do at the time, because it did spread very rapidly, just like COVID has spread very rapidly. Also, we have a lot of racial violence in the post-war era. The promise of jobs in northern industries during World War I really inspired more than 400,000 African Americans to move north. And this is what became known as the Great Migration. We have a lot of blacks leaving the South looking for work in the North during World War I. They will have some success in finding jobs. Blacks migrating to the North encountered racism and discrimination in employment and housing, though. Racial tensions are going to spur a series of race riots throughout the United States in 1919, worst of which took place in Chicago during the so-called Red Summer. And so for 13 days, black and white rioters, they attacked each other's homes, each other's businesses, and also each other. And the whole reason that this even broke out, this riot in Chicago, was because a young black boy was swimming in Lake Michigan, and he swam into the whites-only section of Lake Michigan. And in response to him being in the whites-only section, whites are going to start throwing rocks at him, and they essentially stone him. He ends up drowning because of that. Everyone on the beach that day saw it. There were both black and white witnesses, but the police refused to arrest the whites that had started throwing rocks at the young boy. And because of that, in response to no justice being served, no one being arrested, no one being held responsible for this young boy's death, although there were hundreds of witnesses, that's when the rioting broke out and started. In the end, 15 whites and 23 blacks died during the Chicago riots, and more than 500 people were injured. So in the context of these riots, think about that, like that's happening. We have the Red Scare, we have all this unrest, this uncertainty going on, and then we have a filmmaker that makes a movie entitled Birth of a Nation, and what it does, it idolizes the KKK from the 1860s and showing how the Ku Klux Klan kind of like harassing people and killing and terrorizing people. Woodrow Wilson shows that movie in the White House, and you can watch it on YouTube. It's a 3-hour silent film. He shows that movie in the White House, and when the President of the United States kind of says, it's okay to do that, everyone thinks that it's okay to do that. And we're going to see the revitalization of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Terrorism is never okay in any context. And the Ku Klux Klan is a terrorist group in every definition of the term. And so, we're going to see this homegrown domestic terrorist group kind of rise back up in the 1920s, and we're going to see it sweep through the nation again during the 1920s. Okay, let's move on and talk about some prosperity, consumption, and growth. And we're going to see the government play into the economy. Right? So the dramatic growth of the economy in the 1920s, that resulted from government collaboration with business. In spite of claims that the Republicans in power supported this kind of hands-off approach, this laissez-faire principles. As a candidate for president, Warren G. Harding declared that the Republicans wanted less government and business and more business and government. And after Harding became president, his cabinet included business leaders who embraced this philosophy. Keep in mind, this is not the Republicans of 2022. This is like the Democrats of 2022. Remember, the political parties haven't swapped ideologies yet. So when you think of Republicans 1920s, think of, those are our modern day Democrats. And when you think of Democrats 1920s, keep in mind, those are more like the Republicans of today. So we make sure you guys kind of understand that moving forward. But under President Harding, tax rates for millionaires dropped dramatically. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon believed that this tactic would generate growth by providing the wealthy with incentives to take these economic risks. So what they do is if you make over so many dollars per year, you don't have to pay taxes. But the idea is because you're not paying that money back to the government, instead you should open up another business or create more jobs for other people and add back to the economy. But as we know, that doesn't always happen, right? People are not giving with their wealth. They're kind of greedy. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Although it had good intentions, giving rich people a tax break, in the end, it doesn't work out to favor the economy like they thought it would. And government will support for the wealthy, or government support for the wealthy was accompanied by a decline in regulatory attention to business, like not really making sure that they're being monitored. And so most instrumental in creating collaboration between public and private sectors was Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who rejected government regulation of business in favor of voluntary cooperation between the two sides. So every American president comes up with kind of their agenda, the big thing that they would like to accomplish. If you go back and you remember from chapter 20, we talked about, dollar diplomacy, and that was, how Taft kind of approached problems. Well, in this chapter, we see the American plan, and this is the Harding administration, kind of their pet project, one of their agenda items. And under the American plan, the Harding administration encouraged businesses to provide health care and also pensions to workers to stem the effectiveness of and need for unions. And by the end of the 1920s, union membership had dropped dramatically. In 1921, we had the Teapot Dome scandal. And this is where Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall and Navy Secretary Edwin Denby collaborated in transferring naval oil reserves to the Interior Department. The Interior Department then they distributed the properties to private corporations, including Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company. And by doing that, Fall received compensation from the Mammoth Oil Company of more than $300,000 for the handout. Fall and Sinclair were caught. They're going to be convicted and sentenced to some jail time. This was all kind of kept under wraps, though. It does kind of all start to come out after Harding's death, though, in 1923. And Vice President Calvin Coolidge, he assumed the presidency, but he kind of probably did the right thing. He was like, I wasn't president at the time. I was just vice president. I don't know anything about that. So he really distanced himself from the scandals that had been a part of the Harding administration. But he did say, I will continue to retain Harding's economic policies, but all the corruption, I'm not going to let that continue. Here's a political cartoon just showing you. So it says White House Highway, like on the way to the White House, oil and scandal. This is, and the area was known as the Teapot Dome, where these oil reserves were. And so you'll notice oil and scandal will roll over anyone in the way. So we're going to talk about consumers and the Americans themselves, American individuals. So the growth of business meant an increase in wealth among each individual person, as per capita income grew by about 32%. The expansion of industry resulted from new technologies, shifts in management, and the widespread application of the assembly line to the production of consumer goods. Sorry, that's the graph I want to show you in a minute. The assembly line, in which each worker is assigned one aspect of production, was perfected in the automobile industry. So Henry Ford did not create the assembly line, but he takes it and uses that to produce more Fords. And the time it took to build a single car was reduced from 12.5 hours to less than 1 minute. The assembly line decreased the price of goods as well by lowering the cost of production, and streamlined production and increased income bred the Second Industrial Revolution, which emphasized household technologies and appliances that facilitated housework. Radios became the key source of household entertainment, allowing families to hear music, theater, sports, politics, and religious sermons without ever leaving their homes. And here's the graph that I wanted to show you. So these are units in thousands, and these are 1921 compared to 1929. So we had, roughly over 1,000 cars being made. But look, it suddenly jumps up at the end of the decade, like how many more are being produced. And phonographs about the same. That's a music device. Radio receivers, hardly any of those being produced. And then look at the big jump. By 1929, refrigerators, those weren't even being made yet, but by 1929, we're going to see more refrigerators being produced. None of the new household items revolutionized American life as much as the car, which nourished the growth of related industries and profoundly shaped American culture. The rise of the automobile led to improvements in roadways and expanding leisure and tourist industries, particularly in places like Florida, which drew annual vacationers to its beaches and national parks. For young people, automobiles changed courtship practices and dating, which traditionally had involved some form of adult supervision or a crowd setting. Like, you wanted to date a girl, you would go and hang out with her parents and have a meal with her parents. And kind of everything was done with the parents chaperoning. But now you can go and pick her up and you can do whatever you want because you're in a car, you can get away. And so it provided boys and girls with some privacy and giving them the opportunity to engage in different types of experimentation, especially like sexual experimentation. And sustained consumer industry growth in the 1920s depended on continual demand, so business leaders mobilized a young advertising industry to make goods appealing on both a practical and emotional level. Consumers were urged to think of their social status with every purchase. It's kind of like going and buying shoes. Do you buy shoes for the functionality of the shoe, or do you buy the shoe because it's like the coolest looking shoe out there on the market right now and it's the most expensive? Most of us go towards the most expensive, the one that's going to give you more of that social status standing. Most Americans spent beyond their means in this age of consumption and depended on credit to allow them to have the latest goods. And by the end of the decade, the buy now and pay later approach to retail had left American consumers about $3 billion in debt, which isn't going to be very helpful when we hit the Depression and they have all that debt that they're trying to pay back and they can't. Here's a Chevrolet ad. Again, competing, came out to compete with Ford. But look, like you can get the touring car for $525, the Roadster for $525, a little bit more for the coupe, $715. And this is not monthly. Like, you would pay the $525 and it was yours. This is to buy it brand new. Which, this would have been a lot of money. This would have probably been a whole year's salary for most people at that time. But look at the advertising. Like really, it's appealing because not just men can drive it, but women can also, because it's easy to start. You don't have the crank start on the front of the car. It's easy to steer. It's a light pedal action. So it's trying to appeal to both men and women. Okay, let's talk about urbanization. So the growth of cities aided the spread of consumer-oriented economy. As more people flocked to the cities, advertisers had a more accessible base to target. After World War I, the demand for agricultural goods fell, and many farmers fled to cities in hopes of finding work. And we have the 1920 census reported that for the first time in U.S. history, a majority of Americans lived in cities. The West experienced higher growth than any other region of the country. People flocked to the milder climate. In cities such as Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and LA, Los Angeles boomed. So this is just showing you the shift from rural to urban populations. And you can kind of see people are leaving this area of the South, right? And they're going to places like St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, over here on the East Coast. So these major cities are growing. This is the Black migration that we talked about earlier, but also even, really escaping this part of the South where racism was really rampant. In spite of the genuine prosperity of the 1920s, harbingers of impending financial collapse lurked behind the scenes, and among them was the economic inequality. Less than 1% of American families were in possession of 34% of the nation's savings, and more than 3/4 of American families had no savings at all. So I want to show you this graph really quickly. So bottom 90%, 1923 to 1929, that's like the year span. So during those 6 years, the top 1%, look at how much income they have. They have like 70% of the overall income in the United States. So to make it easy, let's just pretend like we only have $10. Well, they've got 7 of it in their pockets. And everybody else, we have to split the 3 among 100 million people. So it shows you the disparity. In an economy that was driven by the escalated consumption of new goods, only the wealthy and the middle class could afford to purchase new items, but they could not endlessly buy new goods solely to keep the economy going. So the expansion of credit masked these economic weaknesses, but gradually demand decreased and unemployment is going to spike. And eventually the automobile and housing industries, they began to bear some of the impact of the struggling economy. Wealthier individuals had amassed remarkable savings and took economic risks, buying stocks on credit without government regulation. Banks and lenders expanded credit without concern for the potential consequences. So you can kind of see this is all these things with the economy, and they're going to lead up to this huge crash in 1929 that we're not going to be able to come back from. Businessmen created an interlocking system of corporate ownership and control, which meant that one company's failure could cause the collapse of everyone else involved. So that interlocking system, if you're interlocked with another corporation, if they tank, you're going to tank more than likely. Real estate developers in Florida who engage in risky speculation, buying land and properties from afar and assuming that the land would hold or increase its value, they're going to be hurt by storms between 1926 and 1928, which led to the decline in property values and triggered a preview of the coming economic crisis. Agricultural prices declined over the 1920s as a result of decreased demand from the world market and increased mechanization, provoking tenant farmers and sharecroppers to migrate in search of industrial jobs that often remained really out of their reach. The global economy in the 1920s and the prosperity of the United States, we're going to see it really going hand in hand with the Allied countries because they were unable to pay the $11 billion they had borrowed from the U.S. during World War I. And their recovery was really dependent on a poor and broken Germany who did not have the money to pay back the war reparations. So they're going to be blamed for causing World War I, and they have to pay all the countries that they attacked during World War I, they have to pay them back, like war debt. Not war debt, but reparations, like, I'm sorry, here's money to compensate going to war with you. They don't have the money to do that like they're supposed to. And all these other countries that were involved, they're broke too because they were trying to pay for the war. So they're $11 billion in debt. In the United States, we agreed to loan Germany the money to pay off its debts. And Germany paid reparations to Britain and France. And Britain and France are going to return the money to American banks, which had already overextended credit to American citizens. And now really we're relying on European countries to pull their economies together and pay us back. Republican administrators, they really worsened the problem by raising tariffs on foreign goods, which slowed European economic growth. So, and after World War I, the 19th century morality and virtues were transformed by the entertainment industry, which presented Americans with relaxed sexual mores and attractive stars. For women, film idols modeled the flapper style, reflecting the notion of the new woman by wearing short skirts and makeup, smoking cigarettes, drinking prohibited alcohol, and dancing to jazz. In spite of changing sexual and cultural mores, Americans also utilized new entertainment to sustain their religious values. At the end of the 1920s, some 40% of American families had radios and tuned in regularly to programs mixing entertainment and advertising, such as the General Motors Family and the Maxwell House Hour. Maxwell House is a coffee, if you guys don't know. Intellectual trends reflected changing culture as well, and there was a group of writers and artists, and they were known as the Lost Generation. They articulated a sense of disenfranchisement about mass culture, consumerization, and corporate capitalism, and criticized hypocrisy, conformity, small-town values, evangelism, and materialism. We also have psychologists such as Sigmund Freud focus on the role of individuals rather than cultures in shaping behavior, and argued that the sex drive and the unconscious mind are the driving forces behind human behavior. Through racial stereotypes, though they permeated popular entertainment such as the radio show Amos and Andy, science around race began to shift in the 1920s when anthropologist Franz Boas asserted that environmental factors rather than hereditary created racial differences. So what he's arguing is kind of like nature versus nurture, but also it doesn't matter what color your skin is. It doesn't matter who your parents are. If you were born in a very low income neighborhood and you're born into poverty, that plays more into, and he's arguing that plays more into your upbringing than, say, if you come from parents who own like $1 million home compared to someone who only owns maybe, like a trailer home. The differences there are huge. The way that you think about things, the person living in $1 million home doesn't have to worry about putting food on the table. But the person living in a lower income area, they may not even get to eat breakfast that morning, and they're worried about their next meal. That's the thing on their mind. They can't worry about all the other things, like going out and having fun. And that your environment that you grow up in really plays into shaping who you are and who you identify as. We also have the Harlem Renaissance. In the Great Migration, without the Great Migration, we would not have the Harlem Renaissance. And it highlighted for African Americans the presence of racism in the North. But it also fostered the conditions for a cultural renaissance that was centered in New York City's Harlem and the South Side of Chicago. Black intellectuals embraced the burgeoning culture renaissance, declaring that the new Negro rejected white supremacy, embraced their racial pride, promoted equality in politics, and celebrated Black history and identity. The African American Renaissance included developments in art and literature, and the resulting literature embraced the Black heritage and offered a counterpoint to white cultural norms. So instead of trying to assimilate into a white culture and whitewash themselves, what we see is African Americans taking pride in their African Americanism, taking pride in their African roots, and starting to show that in art and literature and writing. Just think of it as most of you are probably like country, right? You're born and raised in this part of Texas. We take pride in being a Texan. We take pride in our cowboy roots and our heritage. That's the same thing that African Americans are doing. They're just taking pride in who they are. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And music was really central in the development of the Cultural Renaissance, with performers like Duke Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and Bessie Smith perfecting the blues and jazz, moving these forms of music from brothels and bars for Southern blacks into the Northern entertainment mainstream. We also have Marcus Garvey and Black nationalism, and I want to show you a picture of Marcus Garvey. This guy was a character. He was a charlatan. He's never in the military. He just liked to pretend that he was, and he liked to dress up and look important. But this Black cultural renaissance fostered the development of a new political vision for African Americans, and the notion of Black nationalism really started to gain momentum with that guy I just showed you, Marcus Garvey, at the center of the movement. In 1914, Garvey established the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, which celebrated racial pride and separatism and promoted a Back to Africa campaign that encouraged African Americans to move to Africa, although most of them had never even seen Africa. But that and unite with native Africans and dismantle the colonial system that was happening in Africa. Garvey came into conflict with the NAACP, which he accused of accommodating white supremacy and failing to embrace the distinctiveness of black culture. The UNIA adapted theatrical tactics that celebrated masculinity and femininity, with Garvey routinely dressing in a military uniform and a plumed hat, while his wife, Amy, extolled the political and cultural accomplishments of black women. They will have 500,000 members and branches across the United States. Despite the organization's popularity, Garvey made enemies among other black leaders and contributed to his own downfall when he was convicted of mail fraud in 1925. Okay, let's move on and talk about cultural wars. Prohibition. So decades of advocacy by temperance groups culminated in 1920 when the 18th Amendment banned the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. That doesn't mean that you can't consume it, and there was an exemption for, like, doctors could prescribe it if it was used for treatment of something, and then also religious practices like Catholics and those other Christians who took the Holy Sacrament, who did communion on Sundays. If they use actual wine, then they could also have wine for Sundays. But for the most part, you couldn't, outside of those few exceptions, you couldn't consume it, you couldn't make it, and you couldn't sell it. Manufacture, sell, and consume. But the ban on alcohol soon proved nearly impossible to enforce. In rural areas, people brewed their own moonshine, while speakeasies were littered throughout big cities offering their clients alcohol and entertainment. So what we see is a rise in organized crime because of the 18th Amendment and also the creation of NASCAR. If you don't know that, Google it. NASCAR prohibition. Just see what comes up. As World War I subsided in Europe, a new wave of Southern and Eastern Europeans are going to enter the United States because they're leaving those, countries that were left in shambles after the war. And what it does is it reignited anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic prejudice, fueling new stereotypes and triggering job competition. And in 1920, a case involving 2 Italian immigrants highlighted concerns about immigration. We have Sacco and Vanzetti, who had embraced radical views and anarchism during World War I. They were arrested in Massachusetts for a robbery that resulted in 2 murders. They are going to be accused of the murders, but there was really nothing to tie them. The only thing that they were guilty of were being immigrants. They actually, we weren't even near the scene of the crime. They had, alibis, they had witnesses that said that they weren't there, but they're still going to be accused and held responsible for this murder. And really, it's what was on trial was their foreignness and their political views. There wasn't any evidence connecting them to the crime. They were found guilty, and they were executed in 1927 in spite of global criticism of the verdict. But that nativism, go back and read what nativism is, on display at the case. It had less extreme but no less significant manifestations across the United States and was embraced by Henry Ford, who believed in 100% Americanism. If you're not from here, then you don't need to be here. And he argued that immigrants chipped away at American morality and civilization, and he firmly embraced anti-Semitism. In his company newspapers, he published the fake Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which had been used to validate violence against Jews in Eastern Europe. So even what your book is trying to point out, even these big names who, employ a lot of people and who people look up to, even they were wrong. They ended up being on the wrong side of history. And in 1924, the influence of nativist sentiment contributed to Congress passing the National Origins Act, a quota system that limited the entry of immigrants from a given country to 2% of the people of that nationality who resided in the United States in 1890. And the law, it really severely restricted immigration from certain places that we deemed undesirable, like Southern and Eastern Europe, while East Asian immigration was still completely prohibited. Again, this is not like an attack on immigration, whether you are for immigrants or against immigrants. What it's just showing you is sometimes we used to play into stereotypes, and we let stereotyping really dictate who we thought was good enough and who we don't think is good enough. And so because of those stereotypes, we're going to see the National Origins Act. So before, we used to openly welcome Greeks and Italians. And we didn't really think anything bad about them. But after the war, and you're going to notice like during World War II, nothing was really wrong with Germans coming in. We have a huge German population here in Texas especially. But we decide that we don't want Germans here, and it's because of that memory. It's because we associate Germany with World War II, right? And so to kind of keep that in mind as we're moving through, your book's not trying to sway you on immigration one way or the other. It's just like, look at how like all these factors play into how we treat different people. And they're telling you why this was done because of the memory of what was, we didn't really like Italians. We didn't really like Jews at the time. And so that's why we tried to keep them out. It's giving you kind of cause and effect. Americanization efforts really consumed popular attention once immigration was significantly reduced, with assimilation and American culture being promoted in factories, schools, patriotic societies, women organizations, fraternal clubs, and unions, and some Catholic churches even began providing confession and sermons in English only. For Mexican Americans in the West and Southwest, Americanization meant not just cultural training, but also education for work and trades, agriculture, and low-wage jobs. The federal government had failed to restore funds to aid public health programs for reservation Indians. Although Congress did not pass the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, Although they did pass Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, most American Indians remained outside of the economic and political mainstream. The rise of nativism continued to hurt Chinese immigrants who faced discrimination and segregation. More restrictions were placed on immigrants, and in 1924, all Asian women were banned from entering the United States. Why would you think Asian women are banned from the United States? Because we don't want a future generation of Chinese Americans. That's what's going on with that certain ban on that group, on that gender. In spite of Americanization efforts, the United States still did not become a melting pot. Cities around the country continued to be home to ethnic enclaves whose residents preserved their native cultural traditions and religious practices. The Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, arose again in 1915 at Stone Mountain, Georgia. And over the next decade and a half, over the next 15 years, it spread throughout the South and into the North and West. And y'all, they're going to become more inclusive. They don't just hate blacks. They hate Catholics. They hate Jews. They hate anyone deemed immoral or un-American, in addition to African Americans. And by the mid-1920s, the KKK boasted a membership of more than 3 million men and women and provided a refuge for native white Protestants who had moved from rural areas into large cities. Though racism and nativism were at the Klan's core, the organization's driving force in the 1920s was the reestablishment of traditional values. The KKK are going to draw women who were fed up with the flaunting of prohibition, for example, and the Klan continued to embrace violence and intimidation as key tactics, but it fused those tactics with participation in electoral politics, electing representatives, senators, and governors in states across the country. And what this picture is showing, this is a double ring ceremony. So these are two couples who are getting married, and you'll notice they're wearing their Klan robes. But this is just to give you an example of just how open people were about it, and how kind of mainstream it was becoming. In the face of a vast cultural change, some Protestants clung to traditional values. Around 1910, two Los Angeles churchgoers published a series of booklets entitled The Fundamentals, which promoted a literal interpretation of the Bible, and fundamentalist preachers used the medium of radio to reach wide audiences. Among fundamentalist core concerns was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution that was first published in 1859, his work on the origin of species, in which he hoisted the central role of natural selection and evolution in the emergences and development of life. Tennessee, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Florida passed laws prohibiting the teaching of Darwin's theory in schools and colleges. And in Dayton, Tennessee, local businessmen who wanted to bring publicity to the town and the ACLU, citing academic freedom and the right to free speech, decided to challenge the ban, laying the groundwork for what would become the trial of the century. This is the Scopes trial. John Scopes, a high school science teacher and football coach, agreed to defy the law, and he's going to teach Darwin's theory in his classroom. Thus, the ensuing trial was brought, and mainly negative attention was brought to Dayton. The renowned attorney Clarence Darrow served as head of the defense team, and William Jennings Bryan, a 3-time presidential candidate and former Secretary of State, he's going to assist in prosecuting John Scopes. The judge, Ralston, at the trial, he opened each session with a prayer and ruled that scientists could not testify on the validity of evolution. With no other alternative, Darrow called Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible. The jury found Scopes guilty after deliberating for only 8 minutes, but an appeals court overturned his conviction on a technicality. Anti-evolution laws stayed on the books, though, until the 1970s. And what ends up happening is the judge is going to end up dying not too long after this, and then William Jennings Bryan, he also gets really sick after this trial. And Scopes, he ended up, I think, having to pay like $100 fine, and then he is dismissed from that teaching position. But it does set a precedent later on. But it's because of the Christian fundamentalists, so that literal interpretation of the Bible, it's really religion versus kind of mainstream thought. That's what we see here. It's not really religion versus politics or anything like that. It's really this base Christian fundamentalism, kind of just going up against modernity and the fast pace of the world and how it's moving and trying to reconcile that. That's really more what we're seeing with the Scopes monkey trial. The Democratic Party is going to be divided in 1924. Southern Democrats united with rural Midwesterners along fundamentalist lines, that literal interpretation of the Bible people. But Democrats in big cities represented immigrant interests, rejecting prohibition and supporting political machines. At the 1924 Democratic Convention in New York City, Democrats could not pin down a platform that satisfied the party's very different constituencies, and among the issues that proved contentious was the party's support of the Ku Klux Klan. The candidates for the Democratic nomination were John Davis, who supported prohibition, and Alfred E. Smith, who was a Catholic from New York City, who had the support of Tammany Hall, a political machine. Davis won the nomination, but lost the election to Calvin Coolidge. And in 1928, urban forces held sway in the party, and the Democrats nominated Al Smith for president and Arkansas Senator Joseph Robinson for vice president. Smith was up against Herbert Hoover, who had an enormous political clout at the time because he was director of the Food Administration during World War I and a Secretary of Commerce, and he is going to easily win the election. That's Hoover. In spite of his defeat, Smith successfully aligned the Democratic Party with urban, ethnic minority voters, winning the country's 12 largest cities and laying the foundation for future Democratic success. So kind of give you an idea here, right? Like you can see Democrats in the South, Republicans in the North, and then this one progressive up there in Wisconsin. Other political parties, including the Socialists and Progressives, retained some influence in the 1920s, and in 1924, Robert Lafayette, ran for president on the Progressive Party ticket. He won only 5 million votes in just one state, and the party collapsed soon afterward. But in spite of their failure to maintain national political party, progressives have influence in the area of conservation. Social workers continue to help stem the problems of urban poverty, and the Children's Bureau provided social welfare. Progressives tried to retain a political presence in the face of rising conservatism, but their weakness contributed to the failure of the government to curb corporate and financial excesses. And then the final crash is going to come. On October 29th, 1929, following a panic in which stock prices plummeted, investors sold off more than 16 million shares worth about $32 billion. Though only a small portion of Americans owned stock, the crash sent the entire national economy into a free fall because many investor borrowers had made only a small down payment and could not pay off their stock purchases. They also could not repay their creditors once stock prices fell. And though the crash had an impact on the economy, the Great Depression that followed was the result of an uneven distribution of wealth, oversupply, a mismanaged credit system, and agricultural decline. Hoover responded to the crisis by lowering taxes on the wealthy and raising tariffs on goods, coming in. The Federal Reserve Board kept interest rates high, and nations around the world saw their economies also suffering. For the American public, the worsening situation signaled the failure of that hands-off government approach to the economy. What we're going to get into next is we're going to look at the Depression, and we're going to look at the failures of Herbert Hoover and the successes of Franklin Roosevelt, and then we'll slowly move into World War II, which is going to pull us out of the Depression.